There's a huge storm raging just outside the window there tonight, and I don't have much else planned, so I thought I'd sit down and perhaps do something a little different to normal. Usually our videos are all about WA or gizmos or the gear we use, that sort of thing. But I spend a lot of my time reading history books for the website, WA Now and Then, and along that particular journey I find all sorts of snippets of information that are interesting little stories, fun stories, some things that are true, some things that are half true, some things that are completely and utterly made up. But what I did originally was to add these stories to the towns they belong to, but they were still scattered all over the place and difficult for people to access. So I decided it might be a good idea if I actually put all those stories together in a little book, and that's what I have here, called The Folklore of Western Australia. Now, I've read folklore books about the eastern states and they always call it The Folklore of Australia. Unfortunately, what happens is you have a look through them and you're lucky if you get one story about WA. They're always about the eastern states. So I thought, time to set the record straight, put together a collection of stories about Western Australia. And what I'll do tonight is just go through a few of the little snippets I've got in here. Hopefully they'll be entertaining, and hopefully you'll get a bit of a laugh out of them. Now, some of these stories obviously are true, some are just a bit of fun. The first one here sounds as though it's true to me anyway. I titled it The Spirit of the Goldfields. A woman and her 3 children arrived in Sandstone in an old rickety cart being pulled by a worn-out old horse. There was a wrapped bundle in the back of the cart that turned out to be the woman's dead husband. The family had fallen on hard times. The husband had been ill and could not work. The woman found what work she could, but there was never enough money. They had decided to head for the coast, hoping that with better conditions the man's health would improve. As they made their way west, they were helped by other travellers, who gave them what food and water they had to spare. But the man died before his family reached the coast, and now the woman and her 3 children were destitute. Arrangements were made in Sandstone for the man's burial, and the hat was passed around, as it usually was on such occasions, to raise money to pay for the funeral. There was a small amount left over which was given to the woman. As the family were now to be sent to the coast, they had no further use for the old horse and cart, and an auction was held. It was sold for £12, but its new owner decided that they had no use for it, and it was put up for sale again. The next owner paid £10, but he too decided the rig was not really what he wanted, and again the cart was put up for sale. This happened again and again until over £100 had been raised. The rig was eventually given to an old prospector who thought he could use the horse but not the old cart. In the true spirit of the Goldfields, all the money from these various sales was handed over to the widow and her children. That obviously sounds like a true story. Now, the next story is, I suspect, a little bit tongue-in-cheek, and I've heard it told about a number of different locations, so it's obviously something that somebody made up at some stage, but it's a bit of a funny story, so I've titled this one Bubbly Bath. It was said there was a barmaid on the Murchison Goldfields who was offered 25 gold sovereigns to strip naked and take a bath in champagne. She took up the challenge, and 24 bottles of fine champagne were emptied into a tub, where she took her bath in full view of the gasping miners. When she had finished, it was decided to put the champagne back into bottles. It is well known that champagne does not go flat quickly. And after all, who wanted to waste so much good booze? The only problem was that when the wine was put back into the 24 bottles, there was still enough left over to fill an extra bottle. In the same vein, another story about booze, we have a blood donor who gives a little bit more. There's a story about a young teenage girl having an accident with a cool drink bottle and cutting herself badly. She was in need of a blood transfusion, and a local donor was found and brought in to supply the blood. As the girl was receiving the transfusion and being stitched up, she started to giggle and behave in a most unusual way for someone who'd just been injured. The transfusion over, the donor returned from whence he had come, the local pub. And the girl was not only left to get over the injuries she had sustained, she had to get over a hangover as well. And sticking with the Goldfields theme, the next tale is called New Chum's Luck. Mickey the priest, who was no priest at all, was a new chum on the Goldfields near Lake Austin, and he used to consistently pester the old-timers about where he could find gold. Eventually they got tired of his continual questions, and they pointed to a rocky outcrop that was known to be barren, and told him to try there. Mickey didn't have the tools to break up the rocky outcrop, so instead he sank a drive next to the reef. Imagine the surprise of the old-timers when Mickey struck a rich lode, and he eventually sold it to an English consortium for a good price. Even with that bit of luck, Mickey was not wise with his good fortune, and was seen sometime later working for wages at Sandstone. Now obviously the Goldfields is a place where an awful lot has happened over the years, and a lot of the folklore of Western Australia is connected with it. So is the next story here about Warden Finnerty. Warden Finnerty was responsible for handing out licenses and maintaining some sort of law and order on the Goldfields back in the prospecting days. This one is called Fear of Finnerty. Magistrate and mining warden J.M. Finnerty was almost a legend on the Goldfields. He was known as hard but fair, and was widely respected by the miners. On one occasion, after two men were arrested and there was nowhere to put them, Finnerty confined them to a tent. Such was their respect for Finnerty, and probably their fear of the consequences if they disobeyed, that they would not leave the tent, even though it was a hot day. The day got progressively hotter, and the two men got thirstier and thirstier, so they hatched a plan to get some beer without leaving the tent. When Finnerty checked on the men later in the day, he found them both to be roaring drunk, and on inquiring into how they got into that condition without breaking their word to him, Finnerty discovered that they had pulled up the tent pegs and walked into the pub under the tent. Rumour has it that he was so amused and impressed with their ingenuity that he let them both off. Now I can't claim to be a great fan of Aussie rules football. I have watched the odd match, but I don't really keep up with the day-to-day goings on, and I certainly don't know a lot about the history of the game. But as far as I know, there was only once when a 7-point kick was made. During a game of Australian rules football, the Daniels Siding Demons were 1 goal, that is 6 points, ahead of the Widgymultha Wanderers as the game neared its conclusion. Widgie's full forward took a last shot at goal just as the final siren sounded, and the ball, that was somewhat the worse for wear, fell apart. The leather case went between the big sticks, 6 points, and the bladder went through the points posts, 1 point. The umpire declared 1 goal and 1 point, and Widgie won the match by 1 point. Now the following is something I wrote myself. Again, it harks back to the Goldfield days, and it is inspired by a book called Mates and Gold. I titled it Gold Fever, and it's a bush ballad. On a squatter's small selection, not far east of Northam Town, waits a wife and her 2 children for her husband to come down, for he's gone off chasing nuggets in a far-off northern field, and he's gone to seek his fortune, gone to reap a golden yield. But the fare up cost a packet, and the mining gear cost more, and before he'd even got there, he was stiff and tired and sore. Now he's gone and staked a claim out, and he's worked it night and day, but it hasn't shown much colour, and he cannot make it pay. Then he hears about a rush on, in a field near Marble Bar, so he sells his worthless claim up, and he tracks another star. Then he's far away from thinking of his wife and kids and home, and he takes up heavy drinking, and he spends his days alone. And the heat and flies and rotgut slowly start to rot his brain, and the last bit of his money quickly trickles down the drain. They find him late one morning, hanging bloated from a tree, and his ghost now haunts the goldfield where the wind blows wild and free. And his wife still waits and wonders as she watches down the track in a hopeless, lonely vigil for her loved one to come back. And each time a swaggy passes, she runs out to see his face, and though hope may spring eternal, her man's lost without a trace. And to top off all this sadness, his old claim was taken on, and just another 5 feet deeper, the next miner's fortune shone. And so it was for many who were drawn in search of gold. Some got rich, some not a penny, some got dead, and some got old. For the gold it was a fever, the men caught like a disease, and today still has the power to cajole and flirt and tease. In a world full of air conditioners and refrigeration and good housing, we forget that times were really tough, and people who lived out in the bush and worked out in country towns had a shockingly hard life compared to what we live today. The following will give you just a little example. It's called Camping Out for 3 years. The first schoolteacher of the Brookton School, Thomas O'Loughlin, was provided with a tent to live in by the Education Board when he was unable to find a house in town. Just 2 weeks after the school opened, there was a rainstorm that forced Thomas to move his bedding into the school building. As he didn't have to rent accommodation, the Education Board withdrew his residence allowance. Living in a tent was considered appropriate accommodation. After almost 3 years in a tent, Thomas wrote to the board, "I hope not to be compelled to spend a third winter in a tent, as my health was so much affected last winter that I was unable to perform my duties as thoroughly as I otherwise would." Poor Thomas was refused his request, and in return asked that he be provided with a new tent, as the old one was no longer habitable. Finally, the Education Board acted, and Thomas got his house. He went on to serve the Brookton community for 25 years. I bet you there was not a time he didn't think about living those first 3 years in a tent. Now on to a slightly different topic. Tennis. Not something you would think would be greatly related to folklore, but this one particular story comes from the Fremantle prison. It's titled Tennis, Everyone's Favourite Game in Prison. Warders in Fremantle prison may have wondered why tennis quickly became the most popular recreation activity in the prison, after the tennis courts were opened near one of the high prison walls. Prisoners quickly worked out that it was possible to cut a tennis ball, place a message inside, and throw it over the wall to an accomplice waiting outside. Contraband could then be inserted into the ball, and it was thrown back over the wall to the waiting inmate. There were a flurry of little green missiles going to and fro across the high prison wall, and it apparently went on for some time before the authorities caught on to what was happening. Needless to say, once this activity was discovered, tennis in prison became a thing of the past. And we'll leave you with this tasty little morsel called Tasty Maggots. Edmund Frederick Duquesne was a 22-year-old when he arrived in Western Australia as a lieutenant with the 20th Company of Sappers and Miners. The men were here to supervise convict building projects, and Duquesne was not initially impressed with dirt being the prevailing feature of the colony. After a while, his attitude softened somewhat, and in one letter he wrote back to his parents, "Another thing I did was to eat some beastly-looking little things they get out of dead black boys. A large white maggot. It tastes beautiful, just like a nut. But there were very few white fellows who will eat them." Edmund had neglected to add that black boys are plants, not, as his parents obviously thought, deceased aborigines. He had quite some explaining to do to calm his shocked parents in the next letter home. Well, that's our first little look at Western Australian folklore. Hopefully you've enjoyed a couple of the tales, and just a reminder, we have a little book available. It's just $3.99. You can hop onto our main website and make a payment via PayPal, and we'll send you the PDF file out in an email. So if you're interested in those sorts of stories, hop on and grab a copy and read the whole book. I guarantee you'll enjoy a lot of the stories in there. Great stuff about WA. Okay, cheers. Catch you later.